We're talking about the absence of the rule of law in India. Um, the most pressing topic around which questions about the rule of law are being asked today is what's going on in the CBI. And one could have different opinions about it depending on the political spectrum. But uniformly, it seems like normally we are used to thinking only about citizens as receiving either the benefit of the rule of law or being victims of not having the rule of law. But now it's starting to look like even the courts are victims of not having the rule of law. There's a lot of things land up in the courts in an unpredictable sort of way, and their responses are equally unpredictable as well, and they're acting out of very little knowledge about many of the things that are coming to them. Do you think the justice system itself is suffering from the lack of rule of law now?
Absolutely. And there are 2-3 reasons for this, right? One is the example of the CBI that you gave. It's essentially important institutions not following a methodology and a process that they're supposed to. See, we all assume that institutions are these monoliths and they will just do, there's a philosophy behind each institution and they'll just do whatever they want or they're supposed to do. Not want, whatever they're supposed to do. And we assume as citizens that, okay, we have gone and voted, and then there are all these institutions and they do their job. But it's people who man those institutions. And somebody has to stand up for the rules that govern each institution, for that institution to give the output it is supposed to do. And the CBI is a great example where you don't know who's actually standing for the institution. We only have, various insinuations in the media, and that's all the media can do. And your point about the judiciary being the victim of, this entire absence of the rule of law is on spot. Actually, and I do talk about this in my book, and, Pratap Bhanu Mehta actually puts it, jurisprudence of helplessness. And he said, basically we go to the judiciary for everything. In Bangalore, we have all been reading the High Court has started giving deadlines for filling potholes. I mean, seriously?
Well, they don't even know how potholes are filled.
Absolutely. So what I'm saying is the judiciary is now being confronted with issues which it has no clue about. What the judiciary is good at is interpreting the law, right? It can say, taking the CBI example, it can take the view on whether a procedure has been followed or not. It can take a view on whether the law is applicable in the correct way. But it cannot take the view as to whether Officer A is, saying the truth, or Officer B is saying the truth, or whether it's possible to fill up all the potholes or count all the potholes and things like that. So the judiciary is being confronted with various issues, and unfortunately it doesn't have a choice. If you go to it with a problem, it can't just say get lost. So it's trying to do something.
But, also when it comes to institutions and the sort of balance between the state, market, and society. I remember more than 20 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled on police reforms. More than 20 years ago, they ruled that news should be allowed on radio. Both of these things have not happened. It's almost as if the Supreme Court has given a ruling, and somebody has written down that the Supreme Court has given a ruling, but nobody feels obliged to do anything because the Supreme Court has given a ruling.
See, and this is one of the worst secrets in the Indian legal system as to how many percentage of orders of the judiciary is actually implemented. And to many of us who are not lawyers, it may come as a surprise, but there are rules, there are directions given by the Supreme Court which are not followed by the high courts. Forget about, the bureaucrats. And today what happens is if you, seek many, if you approach the executive and the bureaucracy to do their job, sometimes they say, can you get an order of the court? As if the court needs to pass an order on everything. So they have given up, this institution, the bureaucracy and the parliament and the legislature have given up their responsibilities and duties to society and are expecting somebody else to fill up their shoes, leading to this chaos and absence of
But there's also the flip side to it. This is a great segue. Because it seems like everybody is trying to do someone else's job, right? The Prime Minister wants to do Swachh Bharat. I mean, at some level, you have to sort of ask yourself, the judiciary wants to fill potholes. I mean, why don't they focus on doing their job instead of one? And why is it that there's a tendency to want to do someone else's job so much?
See,
it's not like the other job is so much more easy or effectively being done as per the rule of law.
Absolutely, and I think this is somehow, and this is the reason I actually wrote my book. I was mystified as to why is there such a big difference between what we have on paper and what happens in reality. So I started exploring actually the gap between what is on paper and what happens in reality. And this question or this comment that you made, Ashwin, about everybody wanting to do somebody else's job is at the heart of the problem we face. Partly because it's not as if they're doing it intentionally. It may start from abandoning the rules of the institutions that you need to follow, that exist. Okay. Ultimately, and I go back to the point I made, I mean, what is an institution? The institution is the people. Today there are 10 people, tomorrow there are 10 different people, and so on and so forth. So it's not as if there's a philosophy that passes continuously. The only philosophy of institutions and the rule of law is reason and process. And if you don't follow reason and process, then you end up with one person trying to do everything. So the MLA wants to be the CEO of the constituency and not make laws and hold the bureaucrats to accountable in the legislature. That's why our legislatures are chaos. And all of us complain about how parliaments and legislature don't function properly. I mean, why don't they function properly? Because we don't appreciate the good debates that have happened in parliament and nobody reports about it. The people only talk about the chaos. And therefore, a elected representative feels that he's better served if he tries to, fill potholes or, initiate Swachh Bharat. So, when everybody else when you have messed up the system so badly, and the moment you start trying to do somebody else's job, and this is something we should not forget, the moment you try to start doing somebody else's job, you are actually undermining your own institution and the other institution. When the judiciary says fill up the potholes overnight, it is actually undermining the ability of the BBMP to even think about filling potholes. And it is undermining itself because it's not going to be filled.
Although BBMP is not really thinking about filling potholes either. But I get your point. But just to continue on this thread a little bit deeper. One is wanting to do somebody else's job. But the other thing is this belief that authority is the way to get things done, right? I mean, we have a very complex system, but it's so much dependent on authority rather than competence, for example, that people essentially are counting on orders to be followed or directives to be followed to get things done. They're not actually trusting institutions to do anything at all.
Yeah, I totally agree. So there are two aspects to this, right? One, I think there's a great belief in India that making orders equals performance, right? So there's a gap between rhetoric and actual tasks being done. So we are great in sort of declaring that something happens. So I forget the author who talks about it, but I've quoted in my book. He says that in laying in a foundation stone is assumed to be actually constructing that bridge or school or hospital. So similarly, passing notifications, you assume that it will get done. Nobody actually goes down to check who is the person who is going to implement this, how are these rules going to be implemented in reality, and does the person there are two aspects of this. The person who is supposed to implement know what are the rules that he's supposed to implement and the intricacies of that, and the receivers, like people like you and me, do we know what the law is? Like, do we know the most common, all Bangaloreans and all, urban citizens face, if there's a, you need to change your khata for your property, you actually don't know what you need to do. So the citizens don't know what the law is, and I keep telling, as a lawyer, the challenge for a lawyer in India is actually finding the law more than practicing it, right? So similarly for citizens, you don't know what the law is, and the officer who is implementing doesn't know what the law is. So simply passing a notification somewhere is not going to help. There's another aspect of it, which is the involvement of citizens in the making of the law.
No,
Today,
we'll come to that.
Okay.
I want to take one other step while we're on this, which is that the law loses its strength and respect if people who follow the law and people who don't follow the law the system doesn't distinguish between akrama sakrama, which is a great example in Karnataka, for example. Whether you built your house legally or illegally seems to have no bearing on anything that you're able to do. You get services or don't get services regardless, and some other thing seems to be influencing that. So at some level it seems like people will naturally conclude that the law is not a plus to anything.
Yeah. So one, and this is a point again I discuss in detail in my book, that there's a convergence of legality and illegality in India. So if I am following the law, I am supposed to get the benefit of the protection of the law. And what does that mean? It involves two things. One, that if somebody else violates my rights, then the law will protect it because I am a law-abiding citizen. And if somebody else breaches the law in a manner that infringes upon my rights, then the law will ensure there is sufficient punishment for everybody else to follow the law. So neither of the two is happening. So in terms, if you view it purely as a consequence and as a market, then for the consequence there's no difference, right? Today, whether akrama sakrama, every time I use the phrase, I sort of cringe, because how can you have a law that is called akrama sakrama, right? Akrama means it's illegal, right? So it is a blatant violation of the rule of law. Okay, akrama sakrama.
In Tamil Nadu, they would call it akrama sakrama sikrama.
Okay. So I think we are undermining ourselves by equating illegality and legality, and
Get to it, no interruptions.
When you are, so there are two aspects to that. One, so I said convergence of legality and illegality. Then, in terms of making of the law, the rule of law will only survive and thrive in a country if citizens feel that they are a part of the making of the law.
But do they want to be?
No,
because a lot of people will tell you, we don't want law, we want order. And you're seeing this around the world in the rise of even populism in some way. If somebody who seems like a strong figure appears in the political landscape, and a lot of citizens say, well, he's delivering outcomes that we care about. And, if they are more on the side of order than on the side of law, there's some amount of support for that.
Yeah, but I think, so I go back, to how we organize society and rule of law. See, this order, and history proves us, order is it's almost like, an opium, right? It's almost like an opium. It sort of, it tantalizes, and it takes you, or it convinces you to give up certain precious things. And the rule of law and rights, rule of law is driven by rights, and rule of law is not against order. Law is not against order. But order cannot be at the cost of law and processes, right? And one of the things that I argue is, in India, for rule of law to survive, we have to bring back reasoning into our institutions. Reasoning in the making of the law, reasoning in the implementing of the law, and reasoning within the judiciary. And all three are different kinds of reasons, right? In the political space, it's a different kind of reasoning. And we are undermining reason in all of these institutions because we are substituting reason with other forms, like order is one thing, but then order begets violence, and that is what we are seeing. I mean, you say you'll impose order, but that will only lead to violence, right? And again, history proves this. Why is this? Because citizens will not feel that they are part of the legal system unless they have a stake in it. And whether we want it or not, and I like your, the challenge that you posed, do we really want to participate in this system, in this process, right? I mean, we don't have a choice because we are the owners of this country. And I want to make this point. Since 1950, we are a republic. We don't have a king. We don't have a dictator. We are all, each of us is responsible for how this country functions. And we can't, nobody else is going to come and solve this problem. Okay? And I want to repeat this. I know you and I, in some other contexts, as Bangaloreans, we can't expect somebody from Delhi to come and solve problems of Bangalore. All of us have to start doing something about it. So as Indians, if we are worried about the rule of law, then we need to solve this problem ourselves. And how do we do this? We can only do this if we feel that we have a stake in the system. And currently, the way the system operates is it treats us as outsiders. And there are some insiders within the system. But as the examples you gave, whether it's Akrama, Sakrama, or CBI, or the Bangalore Metropolitan Planning, or the many number of other examples we can give, it's not as if there are insiders in all these institutions. It's basically institutions being captured briefly and momentarily by different groups at the cost of the rule of law by ignoring the processes. And that is a classic example of absence of the rule of law. I mean, we are seeing absence of the rule of law everywhere.
So one of the things that some of us are trying to do now is to slow down the law. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. That too often you find out about new laws sort of almost in the blink of an eye. They are proposed, they are notionally debated, and they're just passed in legislatures. Justice Hegde used to talk during the anti-corruption movement about how 22 laws were passed within 5 minutes once in Parliament or something like that. That nobody could possibly read all those things even in those 5 minutes, let alone understand them and pass them. So one of the things that there's a push for now is to say, if a law is introduced in this session of Parliament or this session of the Assembly, it can only be passed in the next session. And that would give lots of people time to look at it, intervene, give their opinion, speak to their MLA, and so on and so forth. Do you think that, techno-managerial interventions like this have some potential, or is it fundamentally a social and political problem that we shouldn't even try to solve through technical intervention?
See, this technical intervention sounds very good, but I don't think that's the ultimate answer. Okay, you have to give Parliament or the legislature the ability to pass laws, whatever they want. But what I'm saying is, I go back to reasoning, right? The reason why laws are made so quickly is because the way the laws are introduced today, it's introduced by a few people. Sometimes, I mean, even senior cabinet ministers in different states have told me even they don't know the laws that are introduced. So it's introduced by a small oligarchy of bureaucrats, of senior party functionaries, senior party leaders, maybe 2 or 3, and then brought into the legislature and then passed through. You gave the example of Parliament, but the state legislatures which actually pass more laws that affect us on a day-to-day basis are worse, right? So this delaying the process will happen automatically if the Parliament or the legislature debates the law, which is what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, but with the anti-defection law, you can't vote against your party anyway. So you can debate till the cows come home. Everybody knows what the vote will be, regardless of what the debate is. So now the debate looks like it's just showboating on television. It's basically one stage that is given to you, and you can say all the things that you want. And if you quietly go and observe how the guys and the girls voted later, you'll find that there is not much correlation between what they said on television and how they actually voted.
I agree. I think the anti-defection law is a problem, and it needs to be changed. And but moving away from the anti-defection law, let's assume it will continue for a while. is that even if it's for showboating, if there is a platform for discussion on issues, I think that will itself generate some heat. Let's take the example of this new data privacy bill that's going to be brought in, right? I want to know what my MP thinks about it, right? We all want to know what our MP thinks about it. Our MP may not have heard of it. That's a different issue. But we want him to, and what is he going to vote in favor of it, not in favor of it? We don't know. So currently what I'm saying is it's a complete black hole about how laws are made. So that needs to be revived, and not by saying, oh, we don't trust MPs. Unfortunately, we vote for them, right? And we don't think about this when we vote, but we vote for them, and they are our representatives. So we need to somehow bring in a mechanism where we hold them accountable on issues.
It's an interesting thing that you're saying. I once asked the Parliament Secretary for a record of how my member of Parliament had voted in the last 5 years.
None.
And he said, we don't keep any such records.
There's none.
Then I said, how do you know that the bills actually passed if you don't keep any record of how people voted? And it's almost all show of hands. As you know, that's really what's going on, that unless somebody calls for counting, it sort of almost all passes. But I want to use the last few minutes to bring the conversation to something else. People's expectation and perception of the rule of law on the ground. When you're stopped by a traffic constable, or when you are sort of, when something happens in your neighborhood that's criminal, people have some reasonable expectation that the law should protect them from bad things, and it should sort of go after the bad guys. That fabric itself seems to be weak, that a lot of people are willing to go to their local dada more than they are willing to go to the system that's supposed to protect them.
Yeah, and I actually want to quote Upendra Bakshi, who is India's foremost legal scholar. He wrote in 1982, I think his book is called The Crisis of the Indian Legal System. So he wrote it in 1982, and it's called The Crisis of the Indian Legal System. And he makes this point that in India, nobody willingly follows the law. The rich and the well-to-do and the upper middle class believe they are above the law and it should not apply to them. So they try to influence the functionaries of the law. The poor, they don't have a choice because they're forced into submission and asked to follow the law. So there is no willing following of the law by anybody. And the example you gave, fits straight into that narrative. And why is this? I think this is something that has actually bothered me too much. Why is it that we don't expect our local inspector to treat us fairly when we go into the police station? Many of us cringe at going to the police station itself, right? I mean, we think it's an issue of shame for anybody to be seen in the police station. And I think this goes back to how we view the legal system, right? We forget that legal system is for us and we own it. But we somehow think we are still outsiders and this great messiah will come, whether it's X or Y party or Z party, will come and somehow change this. No. So this ability, we do this because we are able to. We do this, we go to the gunda or we try to influence the cop because we are able to, and the law or the person who is administering the law is available for a compromise at that time. And as long as this continues and as long as none of us willingly follow the law, this is a problem that will continue.
One last thing is about equality. That people, this thing that you talk about, reason presumes that, drawing from equality, there is a logical pathway that lots of people can go through to come to some conclusion. But if equality is not one of those foundations and people don't accept equality as a foundational element, the reasoning itself goes in multiple directions. If I don't see you to be equal to me in some sense, I don't necessarily think that we can come to a reasonable understanding of things together.
I agree, and I think that's a societal problem that actually flows into the rule of law. And when we talk about rule of law, we think it's a legal systems problem, but it's actually a societal problem. It just manifests itself through the legal system. And we can go back and recount what Ambedkar said about in 1950 we entered into a dual system, and actually Ram Guha also quoted that same paragraph yesterday, which I also quote. But Ambedkar makes a different point. He said there is graded inequality in India. Right, and he talked about it only in terms of the caste system, but I think that concept of graded inequality has spread across class systems as well. If you look at it, right, we don't think a person who is not in the same, who doesn't hold the same office, or a constable can talk reasonably or act reasonably. We just don't think so. We think, because he can't reason. So this graded inequality has spread from caste into class and across all societal structures. And as long as this exists, I agree that, so equality in terms of society is a difficult proposition. But that's why we have parliament and legislature and the judiciary, right? To remove all these graded inequalities that arise from passions and use institutions to reason out and remove all these passions, right? Currently we have both failing, and it's a chicken and egg situation, and I'm not entirely sure what comes first, right? Institutions should have done enough to ensure that equality spreads well in society, but that has not happened. But today we have parliamentarians saying, but this is what the people want, and something similar to what you said, the people want this. But it's a role both of leadership and representation, and I don't know which has failed.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes. We could take a couple of questions from the audience during this time if we want to. Anybody? Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Just ask your question. I'll repeat it. Just ask.
Okay. So my question is, as you're saying, we need citizens' participation and all. So is it a right time? Hello, sir. My question is that since you're saying that citizens need to participate, so is this the right time that India needs to bring direct democracy into the country? Like we have seen it happening in Delhi or Rajasthan in banning the liquor, the referendum and all. So maybe not in all the cases, but at least in some, do you think the direct democracy can bring the change in country?
So ballot initiatives, should people be able to put up their own things for others to vote on?
See, I think that's a difficult proposition in India, but because the reason why I'm not dismissing out of hand, because the limited forms of direct democracy that we have introduced through the 73rd and 74th amendments have actually not been implemented. Let's take in rural areas, the panchayats work to a reasonable extent. But in urban areas, there are supposed to be ward committees at each ward, right, which is supposed to be consisting of citizens to supervise what happens in the wards. Whether the drain should be filled first or the footpath should be continuously relayed and all that. It's not been implemented. We have gone to court many times. Many activists have gone to court many times to get the ward committees set up. So there has been a failure in implementing the reforms that have been brought in even about 30 years ago. So there's a challenge, but I think it's a difficult proposition.
Whoever has the mic.
I think there's two people here.
Okay, I'll tell you what, we'll take 2 questions and then we'll close with that. Yours?
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
So we spoke about how there is a lack of the public participating in the entire lawmaking process, and even if they do go and vote, a lot of them end up voting for nota. So one of the underlying reasons is probably they don't want any of the people representing them to be up there because as you mentioned, even the cabinet ministers themselves are unaware of what's going on. So what do you think is the importance of having a basic educational qualification for politicians and the people who are representing us?
Okay, your question, ma'am? Excellent. You take the first one, I'll take the second.
Okay. See, in terms of nota, in terms of what was the follow-up question?
No, essentially educational.
See, I don't think so. See, I don't think educational qualifications necessarily make better leaders, right? But partly because I have a lot of complaints about the education system, but I don't think people are trying this out, right? That you need to have minimal educational qualification, but I don't think so. I don't think it's nice to have, but I'm assuming that we are moving towards a system where most of the people in parliament and legislatures are actually educated. They have a basic degree, right? So it's not as if it's completely uneducated people. So we don't know. I don't necessarily think that education makes you a better leader, or that it sensitizes to the nation's problems or anything like that. It certainly probably makes you aware of processes in institutions, and that's a good thing. But that's not an issue anymore, because parliament and legislatures actually see more and more educated people in as elected representatives.
So, and literally one sentence answer to your question. You don't even need two things. You need only one thing. The system is used to people who go and say, do this for me. The minute you start saying, do this for the benefit of other people who actually need those things, the system begins to respond to you. So the easiest answer to give to you is, find somebody in your own neighborhood who needs your help, go and ask the system to help them. The rest will happen.